The Tragic History of the Military Press, Olympic and World Championship Competition, 1928 to 1972, by John D. Fair, August 29, 2011. For most of the 20th century, the press was the standard means by which the strength of an athlete, especially in weightlifting, was measured. How much can you press was the usual question directed by friends and fellow athletes to any young man who started training with weights. Therefore, it was fitting that when weightlifting competition and rules became standardized at the Amsterdam Olympics in 1928, the press was adopted as one of the so-called Olympic lifts for international competition, along with the snatch and the clean and jerk. While the latter two movements, often called the quick lifts, were regarded more as a test of an athlete's speed and agility, the two-hand clean and press was viewed as a true measure of overall strength, an essential ingredient in determining a weightlifter's worth. It also corresponded closely with the familiar watchwords of the Olympic ideal: swifter, higher, stronger. Problems, however, plagued the press from the outset. Although the original intention was for lifters to perform it in military style, with body ramrod straight, heels together, and head facing forward, this proved impractical, and various forms of cheating developed, enabling lifters to use the larger muscle groups of the legs, hips, and the lower torso in subtle ways instead of relying on just the arm and shoulder muscles. The urge to win by any means, combined with lax enforcement of rules, political pressures, and ultimately a tradition of drift, transformed the press from a strength movement to another quick lift, leading the International Weightlifting Federation to eliminate it from all future competitions at the 1972 Olympics in Munich. Only one account of the rise and fall of the press exists: Dave Webster's brief chapter in his classic survey, The Iron Game. Webster describes the pre-1939 press as a movement for strong men, in which the body had to be kept straight and as still as possible, and the arms only moved, and contrasts it with the hip-swinging, knee-kicking actions so characteristic of later decades. He attributes this corruption of the military press ideal to post-war innovations by Russian lifters that were widely imitated and officially tolerated. This interpretation coincides with views propagated by Bob Hoffman, American coach and publisher of Strength and Health, who did much to shape the Iron Game opinion in the 1950s and 1960s. Hoffman associated increases in press poundages and press problems of this era to illegitimate methods employed by the Soviet Union and its satellites to secure victory in weightlifting and thus display the superiority of communism. The cumulative opinions of these authorities on the importance of the so-called Russian press has been considerable. A re-examination of Olympic and World Championships on a yearly basis reveals quite a different story. While the Russians and their allies must share some responsibility for erosion of pressing standards, basic trends were already set before they entered the international arena in 1946. Others, including the Germans, the French, and the Americans, were at least equally culpable for corrupting this classic strength lift and setting in motion the events that would lead to its abolition. One of the earliest statements on the importance of the press emanates from Alan Calvert, founder of Milo Barbell Company in 1903 and an early proponent of progressive weight training. The press is always slow and steady, insists Calvert in an early issue of Strength magazine. You cannot find a better test of pure strength than a two-arm press with a barbell. Whenever a man starts to talk to me about knack in lifting, I give him a fairly heavy barbell and ask him to make a two-arm press. If the legs are held straight, nothing will send that bell up except strength, and you need the strength in the triceps of the arm, the small of the back, and particularly in the deltoid muscles on the points of the shoulders. No skill is required to press a bell aloft after you once have it at the chest, and that is why I consider the two-arm press as the best strength test. Accompanying these noble sentiments from one of weightlifting's patriarchs, however, was an admission that pressing styles differed according to nationality. While the French required their lifters to stand almost bolt upright, the Germans and Austrians allowed considerable backbend, which in turn allowed them to lift greater weights. But there were few opportunities for the intrusion of politics, as there were few international meets, no regulatory body, little standardization of lifts, and haphazard record keeping, at least until the 1920s. Although weightlifting was included in the first Olympiad in Athens in 1896 and St. Louis in 1904, it was not contested at London in 1908 or at Stockholm in 1912, and the 12 World Championships from 1898 to 1920 were unofficial and unrepresentative of nations outside Central Europe. Likewise, there was no pre-war governing structure for weightlifting. Although the foundation was laid for an international body at a meeting of German, Italian, and Dutch delegates at Duisburg in 1905, it was the French under Jules Rosset who revitalized the Fédération Internationale Haltérophile, FIH, at the 1920 Olympics in Antwerp. These initiatives coincided with organizational developments in England, where the British Amateur Weightlifters Association, BAWLA, was founded in 1901. In the United States, Otley Coulter wrote an article on honesty in weightlifting in the January 1917 issue of Strength, in which he argued for greater regulation. After the war, Coulter renewed his appeal for accurate records and published a list of European and American records in 46 lifts. Coulter's ideas were brought to fruition through the organizing talents of two British émigrés, Bernard and George Jowett, both with connections to Bala. As respective editors of Health and Life and Strength, they formed the American Continental Weightlifters Association in 1922 as a national regulatory body. Much confusion remained, however, over what should be included in the contested lifts. Calvert, based on his knowledge of what was practiced in Europe, recommended 8 lifts: the right and left arm snatch, right and left arm swing, right and left arm jerk, and the two-arm press, executed in both military strict and conventional loose styles. But as the first National Weightlifting Championships, organized by David Willoughby in Los Angeles in 1924, there were 5 standard lifts: one hand snatch, one hand clean and jerk with other arm, two hand snatch, two hand military press, and two hand clean and jerk. Lifts and rules alike were drawn, through French translation, from FIH regulations. Press rules were divided into first clean and second press motions. In executing the latter, a lifter was required to pause 2 seconds, then lift up the bar vertically until the arms are completely extended, without any jerk nor sudden start. Throughout the press, the athlete's body must constantly stand in a vertical position. Any departure from it, any footwork, heel lift, etc., and any bending, however little, of the legs were grounds for disqualification. These procedures were followed at the Paris Olympics in 1924, but nations were still far from unanimous on what lifts and styles should be allowed. The Americans substituted the one arm for the two-arm military press and the two-hand deadlift for the one-arm snatch in 1925. The British rotated lifts yearly, including such variations as the one-hand swing, the two-dumbbell anyhow, the one-hand clean, the bent press, and the deadlift. The Germans sent no representatives to Paris in 1924, but employed the same 5 Olympic lifts at an international meet at Neuenkirchen. Germany's absence was occasioned not by controversies over rules or protocol in weightlifting, but by international political strife. Excluded from the Antwerp Games in 1920, resentful over the Treaty of Versailles, beleaguered by reparations payments, and humiliated by French occupation of the Ruhr, and the greatest inflation in history, it was hardly surprising that Germany opted out. It was therefore, by default, that the French strict style of pressing, use of glow barbells, and preference for one-hand lifts prevailed in the early 1920s. This pro-French bias, underscored by the influence of FIH President Rosset, was challenged by 2 developments in 1925. First, the financial settlement of the Dawes Plan and the territorial agreements concluded by the Locarno Treaties instituted Germany's entry to the League of Nations and its reaffiliation with the International Olympic Committee, IOC. Second, a 1925 meeting of the IOC in Prague, contrary to the wishes of Rosset, adopted a triathlon consisting of the press, snatch, and a clean and jerk for the 1928 Games in Amsterdam. Henceforth, Americans, under the tutelage of Jowett and the ACWLA, were encouraged to practice and compete in the new Olympic lifts. Most of the lifts will be strange, but the only way to learn them is to make them competitive lifts. No one seemed sure at this point, however, what kind of press would be required at the Olympics: the French military style or the German slow or Olympic style. Jowett advised the former, arguing that a man who can do a 2-hand military press can also do a slow press, but the reverse was not so. What transpired at Amsterdam had momentous consequences for the sport. It was the German press that prevailed, and German lifters who took highest honors. The major difference between French and German pressing techniques is that the former required the lifter to remain almost perfectly upright with eyes straight forward and heels together, whereas the latter permitted a back bend prior to extension. Afterward, most national associations and the FIH, steeped in the French tradition, continued adherence to the one-hand lifts and to the military press. All 5 international lifts, including the military press, were performed at American Championships held in 1929 by both the Amateur Athletic Union under Dietrich Wortmann and the Association of Barbell Men under Mark Berry. So proud were Americans of their strict presses that they submitted a claim to a world record and the accolade of World's Strongest Man on behalf of Sigmund Klein, a lightweight who pressed 221 at a strength show held at Herman's Gym in Philadelphia in 1931. This poundage, Klein pressed in magnificent style, heels together, and the bar pressed off his chest. Not the slightest bend was noticed, the strictest sort of erect position being maintained throughout. A further implication made by Berry was that the military press, executed in the strictest manner, provided the best measure of pure strength and ultimate criterion for determining the world's strongest man. Similarly, Jowett, another advocate of a strict interpretation, recognized that the 2-hand military press has always been accepted as a true test of the strength of a man. Understandably, it requires a considerable period of adjustment for Americans who embraced idealistic notions to comprehend fully the impact of the IOC policies set in motion at Amsterdam. The first reckoning involved the gradual acceptance of the 3 Olympic lifts over the multiplicity of lifting movements previously contested by clubs throughout the country. Strength prefaced its report of a show at Rochester, New York in early 1932 by noting, "This being an Olympic year, Arthur F. Kay, conductor of many successful strength shows in the western New York vicinity, decided to have the Iron Boys try out their physical prowess on the 3 Olympic lifts. An even greater enlightenment for the Americans was the loose interpretation of pressing rules at the Los Angeles Games in 1932, where Barry, the American coach, knew of the liberties taken by the Germans at Amsterdam is uncertain, but he was aware of their slow press tradition and was not surprised by the loose styles they employed in training prior to competition. What he was not prepared for was the behavior of the French. Knowing that they dominated the ruling councils of the FIH and had drafted the rules, Barry naively assumed that Gaelic traditions of strictness would be upheld. He admitted to a misunderstanding of international regulation. In performing the 2 hands military press, no thought is given to maintaining the rigid strictness to which Americans have of recent years been accustomed. Briefly, we might say that internationally the press is executed as follows. After cleaning the barbell to the chest, the athlete assumes a position of a most decided arch of the back, and he may or may not hold the bar on the chest depending upon whom might be judging. Of course, according to the rules as written, it is essential to do so. However, we witnessed various infractions of this rule. Nor did foreign lifters abide by the rule requiring the head to be perfectly erect and eyes straight forward. Barry was confused that actual performance of lifts by foreigners did not correspond to the rules. Quite understandably, the French could not allow their national rivals to gain an unfair competitive edge. But why they did not use their considerable authority in the FIH to bring about enforcement of the rules will forever remain an iron game mystery. Instead, they adopted the more expedient technique of their German adversaries, thereby putting into place an interpretive dilemma that would plague the administration of the press for the next 4 decades. Even more surprising to Barry was the arrogance of the French, whom he had formerly regarded as the most reliable and fair-minded of the Europeans. He had gone to Los Angeles with full confidence in the French and was rudely surprised at the high-handed manner in which they controlled things and favored their own men. After this, I shall have no faith in French records or performance. Most galling was the loose style of French light heavyweight Louis Huston, and attempts by French referee Eugene Gaulieu to intimidate the side judges into passing his presses. America seemingly stood alone, not only in its stand for strict pressing, but in its distaste for the Olympic lifts. Afterwards, at an FIH executive committee meeting, the Americans recommended that the 5 international lifts be employed in 1936, but were told that this decision could only be made by the IOC. Upon returning home, Barry did some serious soul-searching, attributing his team's relatively poor showing in great part to the lax and partial officiating. He tried to understand how the decisions rendered could be so much at variance with the rules. However, much it offended his moral sensitivities, it was obvious to Barry what American lifters would need to do in order to improve their standing by the next Olympics. Though harshly critical of European press techniques at first, he eventually came to admire their speed, especially the lightweights, who furnished the classiest lifting of the entire competition, as both Hostin and Olsen lifted in the easiest and fastest possible manner. The styles displayed by these men might be well copied by any ambitious lifter. Indeed, future American success depended on adopting European methods. Barry reasoned that when the rules are interpreted so flexibly as to permit of a shrug or heave of the shoulders as the press is started, and the head may be to some extent tilted, then it not only is feasible but becomes essential that some special training for this additional play of the body be incorporated. To execute this freer and easier press, he instructed American lifters to stand erect with a barbell at the chest, the feet either together or no more than 16 inches apart, flatten the chest and draw the arms back. Then, in one movement, you are to shoot the arms forward and thrust out the chest as you extend the arms overhead. As the bell ascends, arch the back and tilt the head back. Thus Barry, following the French lead, caved into the course of least resistance, one that would be in his nation's best interests. If, as we are ambitious to do, we hope to beat the foreigners at their own game, we must sooner or later adopt identical training methods and interpretations of the rules. America's future success as a lifting power depended on it. During the next several years, Barry promoted the Olympic lifts and the lessons he had learned at Los Angeles on how to perform them at national and regional contests. You shall in time see, he wrote in 1933, that in keeping with our march towards perfection in regulation, we shall have reached the standard of the European in lifting excellence. Still, at the local level in the United States and England, a tradition of strict officiating in the press had taken root. In keeping with the AAU and BALA regulations against backbending, and there was considerable resistance to the new international interpretations. Just before the 1936 Olympics, the British attempted to deal with these incongruities by changing their rule structure. BALA regulations, largely in response to Hostin's egregious violation of the rules, now called for the bar, on completion of the clean, to come to rest at the sternum bone where the collarbones meet. This position at the top of the chest now enabled the lifter to assume a slight layback prior to pressing. These guidelines were eventually adopted by the FIH at the Berlin Olympics, where lifting totals overall were significantly higher than in 1932. Thus, most major lifting powers, first the Germans, then the French, followed by the United States and Britain, who were also the world's foremost political powers, acted successively to relax the rules to further their own nationalistic agendas. Yet a grudging respect remained for lifters who adhered to the strict form, particularly for the Egyptians, who remained outside the political loop. W. J. Lowry, secretary of BALA, observed that middleweight Kader El Tuni's remarkable 259-pound press at Berlin was executed in strict style. It proved conclusively how real champions can adhere rigidly to definitions and still beat those whose training is with a view to seizing every possible advantage which may be given by lenient judges. Some strict presses, though admirable as displays of pure strength, rarely won championships. Further corruption of the pressing ideal was instituted by Bob Hoffman, who displaced Barry as the prime mover of American weightlifting after Berlin. Though he revered the press as a test of sheer strength and for determining the strongest man, Hoffman was envious of the Europeans and always seeking an edge for his lifters. At the 1937 World Championships in Paris, he was impressed by Anton Geidel's 254-pound press as a light heavyweight. It combined wide grip with a great deal of backbend, which in Guido's case was not cause for disqualification, as he stands in this position at the start of the lift. Americans Stanley Kratkowski and Steve Gobb copied this style, as did virtually the entire team that Hoffman led to the 1938 championships in Vienna. Eventually, Hoffman added speed to this pre-press lean-back technique, thereby doing away with the last vestiges of the old military press and turning the old slow press into a fast press. But he realized that such artistry was not without problems. This form of the press is a bit difficult for the judge and referee to correctly pass on. It's difficult to determine exactly whether some of these presses have been strictly presses, but many high poundages are correctly hoisted in this manner. Indeed, American advances in the late 1930s were fueled in part by this improved technique. The Americans are adept at this style of pressing, observed George Walsh, a British official. And in spite of the criticisms you may have heard about them, the Americans are infinitely better and more scrupulous in their pressing than the majority of the Continental lifters. In a distant foreshadowing of the future development of the French, no doubt that other nations were seizing the edge they once held, proposed abolition of the press at the FIH meeting held at 1937 World Championships. One of the foremost practitioners of the new fast press was Tony Terlazzo, whose dazzling success in winning an Olympic gold medal 1936, 2 World Championships 1937 and 1938, and world records in the press heralded America's arrival as a world-leading weightlifting power. As Walsh explained, just after Terlazzo's Olympic triumph, he varies his styles occasionally in order to exploit every possible method of improvement. But domestically, it was John Grimmick whose combination of raw strength and unmatched physique made the greatest impression. Bill Curry, one of the best lifters in the South, recalls attending the 1940 National Championships in New York, where he saw Grimmick press 285 pounds with great speed and pronounced backbend while wearing a wide steel reinforced belt for support. Upon returning to Atlanta, Curry crafted a similar belt and perfected the new pressing technique. From April to December, his press advanced from 235 to 285 pounds. Rule specialist Rudy Sablow was also present and recalls that Grimmick did press from a layback he assumed at the beginning of the lift and did not change during its performance. His was not an abnormal layback and was within the rules. Photographs in Strength and Health of pressing styles at the 1940 Middle-Atlantic Championships show Terlazzo and heavyweights Louis Abeli and Steve Stanko with considerable back arch. An action shot of the great John Davis pressing 323 pounds at the 1941 National Championships reveals a backbend as severe as those of lifters who stirred up so much controversy decades later. Hoffman rationalized that it was advisable for his lifters to test the limits of official tolerance. While too much backbend means disqualification, he cautioned, many pressers adopt a definite arch at the start of the press and maintain this arch throughout the press until the referee's signal. This was permissible as long as there was no attempt to straighten the back. With Americans performing better than ever, there seemed no cause for concern to Hoffman over erosion of officiating standards. From a broader perspective, however, it is obvious that many of the problems later to plague the press were well in place in the 1930s.